I want to start with the most important mistake in this entire story. The mistake was not tactical first. It was psychological. It was the belief that Iran was brittle at exactly the moment its enemies most needed it to be brittle. That is the illusion that sits underneath everything in this document. If you strip away the slogans, the leaks, the panic, the public threats, the whispered negotiations, and the battlefield theater, the core idea was very simple. People around Trump believed there was a golden moment. They believed Iran was economically weak, politically divided, socially agitated, and therefore vulnerable to a fast external push. They believed internal unrest could be accelerated. They believed the system could be shocked. They believed a little covert help here, a little sabotage there, some outside pressure, some money, some communication support, and maybe a few carefully timed blows would create the kind of internal collapse that could be dressed up as regime change without a real invasion. That was the fantasy. And this source document is, above all, a record of that fantasy failing. I want to be very clear about that, because once you understand the failure at the beginning, everything that comes after starts to make sense. Why the sudden hesitation? Why the pause? Why the mixed messaging? Why the desperate extensions? Why the public insistence that things are somehow going well while the strategic position is obviously deteriorating? Because the original bet did not work. The source lays it out plainly. The opening concept was not just bombing. The opening concept was disruption from within, economic pain, protest energy, reform, conservative friction, outside intelligence operations, covert communications, money flows, agitation, and the expectation that enough pressure would produce internal fracture. But the country did not implode. The armed forces stayed intact, the command structure stayed intact, the integrated air and missile defenses stayed intact. And once that happened, the whole war changed shape. That is the first truth. Now here's the second. Iran is not a militia camp. It is not a broken microstate. It is not a temporary construction waiting to be knocked over by one hard shove. It is a civilizational state. That phrase matters. And I think Americans almost never understand it properly. A civilizational state is not just a country with a passport and a flag. It is a political organism sitting on top of a very deep historical memory. Persia did not arrive yesterday. Turkey did not arrive yesterday. These are old states, old cultures, old strategic minds. They compete. They distrust each other. They have fought each other for centuries. But they understand one thing very well. If one of them is broken up by outside powers, the strategic consequences do not stop at the border. That is why one of the most important details in the document is not even American. It is Turkish. The source says the Iranians and Turks cooperated to destroy Kurdish fighters moving from Syria into Iran. That matters because it tells you that whatever their historical rivalry, Ankara saw state survival and civilizational stability as the higher priority. In other words, the people selling Trump the dream of Iran as isolation misunderstood the map. That misunderstanding is enormous because if Turkey will not help you unravel Iran, and Russia will not help you unravel Iran, and China will not help you unravel Iran, and much of the region does not actually want Iran shattered into pieces, then your golden moment is not golden at all. It is just reckless. And that brings me to the third truth. The so-called pause is not peace. It is exhaustion management. I think that is one of the most honest lines in the whole document, because once the internal collapse scenario failed, the war had to be evaluated in military terms. And when the military evaluation happened, I think somebody finally told Trump what he should have understood before the first move. The target was not collapsing. The air defenses were not gone. The missile forces were not gone. The regime was not gone. The country was not gone. The strategic problem was now much larger than the political sales pitch. That is why the source says this break has nothing to do with peace talks and everything to do with replenishing stocks. That is a devastating judgment, but I think it is probably correct. Washington is not pausing because it found wisdom. It is pausing because it has burned through expensive munitions, because the air campaign failed to produce the promised result, and because the next phase cannot even be attempted without dragging more material into theater. And that is where the story becomes more frightening. Because once a war pauses to reload rather than pauses to rethink, the danger is not ending. The danger is mutating. Now, I want to talk about warfare itself because the source makes a very important argument here. The people who sold this war were thinking in one era. The Iranians were fighting in another. That is the fourth truth. The old assumption is that if you are a technologically superior military, if you can bomb hard, if you can strike deep, if you can create fear and destroy infrastructure, then eventually the other side either surrenders, fragments, or becomes so blind and broken that you can dictate terms. But the document is pointing to something very different. It is pointing to what 21st century warfare looks like when space-based intelligence is fused with distributed strike systems, when reconnaissance is near real time. When targeting can be shared rapidly, when missiles and drones can be concentrated against high-value assets in minutes, and when geography protects the defender more than the attacker wants to admit. The source says this directly. Iran is linking external intelligence support to a wide strike architecture inside its own territory. And that is exactly why fantasies about invasion, island seizures, or clean air, only victory, are absurd. That is the war that Trump-esque people walked into, not the war they imagined. And once you see that, all the talk about seizing islands, all the talk about boots on the ground, all the talk about quick breakthroughs starts sounding insane. You cannot treat 2026 like 1944. You cannot pretend an island in the Gulf is some neat stepping stone to control when intermediate range systems can turn it into a graveyard. You cannot pretend an air campaign automatically creates freedom of action when the other side can still identify, target, and strike in depth. You cannot pretend a country half the size of India and full of 90+ million people is going to fold because a few planners in Washington decided the moment feels right. And that brings me to the fifth truth. There is no positive endgame here, not a real one. That is the heart of the document. People keep asking, how does this end regime change? With what army occupation? Of what scale partition? Under whose control? Protection of the oil. By whom? The source is brutally honest on this point. There is no serious path to controlling Iran with American boots. Afghanistan should have killed that fantasy forever. Vietnam should have killed it. Iraq should have killed it. The size of Iran, its population, its geography, its strike depth, its strategic partners, and its willingness to absorb punishment make the dream of a controllable military solution almost delusional. So when people ask what the end game is, I think the real answer is that the people who pushed this war preferred not to think about the end game at all. They thought about shock, they thought about leverage, they thought about panic, they thought about a short decisive phase. They did not think seriously enough about what happens if the target survives. And once the target survives, the whole logic flips. Now, the stronger side has to decide whether it admits the error, doubles down, or drifts towards something much worse. That is why this moment is so dangerous. Now, I want to go to Israel because the source is very dark here, and I think we have to face that darkness. The sixth truth is this. From Netanyahu's point of view, this is no longer a normal war. It is existential. The document says it plainly in Netanyahu's mind, if Iran is not destroyed, then Israel is destroyed. That is not my language. That is the logic the source attributes to the Israeli leadership. Once a state begins operating on that logic, every limit weakens. And if every limit weakens, then the danger of nuclear use stops being abstract and starts becoming a real strategic question. That is why the discussion of Dimona underground tests Israeli nuclear capability and the wider nuclear chain reaction matters. Because the most dangerous thing in the world is not simply a nuclear armed state. It is a nuclear armed state that begins to feel cornered inside an existential framework. If Israel convinces itself that it is in a win or los, everything war, then the probability of insane action rises. And if insane action rises, then this is no longer only a Middle East war. Then it becomes an Armageddon corridor. The source is unflinching on this point. Use of a nuclear weapon would not end the war cleanly. It could do the opposite. It could bring in Turkey, Pakistan. As nuclear promise to Turkey becomes relevant, Russia, as southern flank concerns become relevant, China, as energy dependence becomes relevant, and the whole quadrangle of China, Russia, India, and Iran becomes much more dangerous. That is what people are not understanding. They are still speaking as if one state as nuclear use would function like a neat final punctuation mark. But in a world like this, it could function like an ignition event. That is the real nightmare. Now, let us talk about Trump himself, because the seventh truth in this document is brutally simple. He was lied to, and he let himself be lied to because he wanted to hear the lie. That is my reading. The source suggests he listened far too much to the Israelis, to billionaire donors, to people around him who had already decided that Iran must be broken, and to a fantasy that a short decisive war was available. It also suggests that serious warnings existed and were ignored. That matters because incompetence in war is rarely just ignorance. Usually it is selective listening. You hear what serves your desire. You ignore what disturbs your ambition. You choose advisors who confirm the appetite you already have. And then when reality arrives, you do not have a strategy. You have excuses. That is what I think the pause really represents. Not wisdom, excuse management, time buying, rearmament, narrative repair. And maybe if we are lucky, a tiny space in which Trump could still do the one thing the source says he should do. Admit the mistake, fire the people who misled him, disengage, and ask for real mediation help. The source says this directly. If he actually stepped forward, admitted this was a mistake, and asked others trusted by all sides to help end it, the world would probably assist. That is still the cleanest remaining exit, but I am not confident he will do it, because the eighth truth is that the American political system is full of people who still prefer escalation to humiliation. Congress clapped, the donors still hover, the lobby still works, the consultants still whisper, the media machinery still knows how to sell one more offensive, one more extension, one more war-winning phase, and there is always another fantasy ready, just one more assault, just one more target set, just one more surge of firepower. But if the foundation of the strategy was wrong, then doubling down does not produce redemption, it produces scale. And scale in a war like this is exactly what the world cannot afford. So if you ask me what this source document is really about, I would put it like this. It is about the collapse of a fantasy. The fantasy that Iran was weak enough to topple, isolated enough to bully, brittle enough to crack, and disposable enough to gamble against. That fantasy failed. And because it failed, the people who launched the gamble are now standing in front of a much more terrifying reality. A huge state, a resilient military structure, a warfighting model better adapted to the present than they expected. A region that does not want Iran broken, major powers that will not stand by and watch it happen. An Israeli leadership operating inside existential logic, and an American president who still does not seem capable of admitting that what he was sold was not a strategy at all. It was a delusion. That is why this moment matters so much, because once delusions fail in war, the next moves become much more dangerous than the first ones. And unless someone intervenes with actual statecraft instead of vanity, donor pressure, and fantasy air campaigns, the road ahead does not lead toward victory. It leads toward a wider disaster that too many people in power still seem unable to imagine clearly, and is right on top of them.